if you overthink, if you replay conversations, if you research for hours before choosing anything, this is for you. There's a simple shift that decisive people use that instantly cuts through the noise. And I promise, it's not just trust yourself. It's not about confidence, it's not about personality, and it's definitely not about gathering more information. It's something much simpler than that. And once you see it, you won't be able to unsee it. So this is what we're going to break down today. Not theory, not motivation, actual practical ways to become someone who decides. And I've got 6 simple shifts for you to make that are going to help you with this. And if you stick with me, it's going to change everything for you. So let's start with the first shift. Trust yourself to handle the outcome, which is this. I want you to start trusting yourself to handle the outcome. Let me give you a very ordinary example. You're buying something online. Maybe it's a laptop or a course or even just a pair of shoes. You open one tab, then another, then another. You compare reviews. You read Reddit threads. You watch 2 YouTube videos. You check the return policy. You leave it in your cart. And then 2 days later, you're still thinking about it. Now, here's what's interesting. The problem wasn't a lack of information. You had enough information 20 minutes in. The problem was this. You didn't trust the version of you who is going to live with the outcome. That's what makes decisions feel so heavy. It's not just, what if I choose wrong? It's also, what if I choose wrong and then I have to live with it? And that shows up everywhere, not just laptops, career moves, relationships, starting the business, joining the gym, leaving the job, raising your prices, booking the flight. Most people think they need more clarity, but what they actually need is a stronger internal position. So here's what decisive people do differently. They don't ask, what's the perfect choice? They ask something much more practical. Do I trust myself to handle whatever happens next? That's the real shift. Because most decisions in life, they don't come with perfect information. Sometimes the job works out, and sometimes it doesn't. Sometimes the investment pays off, and sometimes it doesn't. Sometimes the relationship grows, and sometimes it ends. But decisive people understand something that most people forget. You don't need to make the perfect decision. You just need to trust yourself to deal with the outcome. If it works, great. If it doesn't, you pivot, you adjust, you learn something, you make the next move. In other words, you trust the future version of you to be resourceful. Because here's the ironic part. Trying to avoid imperfect decisions often leads to the worst outcome of all, not deciding. Staying stuck, losing time, letting opportunities drift past while you keep researching and second-guessing. An imperfect decision you can learn from will move your life forward, but no decision at all that keeps you exactly where you are. So the shift isn't about being fearless. It's about building the kind of self-rest that says, whatever happens next, I'll deal with it. And once you start operating from that place, decisions stop feeling like traps. They just become the next step. And by the way, if you have ever had 37 tabs open before choosing a toaster, I see you. You are not broken. You are just making decisions from the wrong place. So let's fix that. All right, coming. Decide from identity, not emotion, up, is shift number 2. And it's this. Decide from identity, not emotion. Decisive people do not decide based on how they feel in the moment. They decide based on who they are becoming. And those are 2 completely different operating systems. Most people decide emotionally. They ask, do I feel ready? What if this doesn't work? What if I regret it? What if I choose wrong? But emotions are temporary. They spike, they dip, they react to discomfort. And if you wait to feel calm before you decide, you will be waiting forever. Decisive people do something much cleaner. They ask one question. Which choice aligns with the person that I'm becoming? That's it. It's not the safest choice or the most impressive choice or the most comfortable choice. It's the aligned choice. So let me make this very concrete. When I left medicine, I did not feel certain. I did not wake up one day flooded with confidence. I felt uncomfortable. I felt exposed. I felt unsure. But I knew something very clearly. I was becoming someone who valued autonomy, impact, and creative ownership. Staying would have been emotionally safer in the short term, but leaving was aligned with my identity in the long term. So I chose from identity, not emotion, and that's why it stuck. Here's what this looks like in everyday life. So let's say that you're deciding whether to raise your prices or go back to school or start learning Spanish or apply for the job or end the relationship. Emotional decision sounds like this. I don't know if I'm ready. I don't know if I'm good enough. What if this fails? Identity-based decision sounds like this. I am becoming someone who plays at that level. I am becoming someone who invests in themselves. I am becoming someone who commits. See the difference? One is fear regulation. The other is identity construction. It's important to know that when you decide from identity, you don't need to feel fearless. You just need to feel aligned. Alignment is quieter than confidence, but it's much more powerful. Now, let me give you something practical. Next time you're stuck, instead of asking, what's the right choice, ask, if I were already the person that I am trying to become, what would he or she do? And then do that. Even if your stomach tightens a little, that's the move. That's how decisiveness builds. Not from certainty, but from congruence. And by the way, this does not mean reckless decisions. We are not out here quitting jobs with no savings because identity. We are aligned, not impulsive. There is a big difference. Now, shorten the decision window. Once you start deciding from identity instead of emotion, something really interesting happens. You stop needing endless time to think, which brings me to the third shift. I want you to shorten the decision window. Okay, so once you start deciding from identity instead of emotion, something else becomes very obvious. Most indecision isn't about complexity. It's about time, specifically too much of it. You give yourself too much space to debate, and in that space, fear multiplies. So let me explain what I mean. Have you ever noticed that when you first consider doing something, there's actually a flash of clarity? You think, oh, I should do that. And then you think about it some more, and then you're suddenly in hour 3 of research, or week 3, or year 3, and now it feels a lot heavier than it did at the beginning. That's not because you got wiser, it's because you opened the door to rumination. There's a psychological phenomenon called the Zeigarnik effect. Unfinished decisions occupy mental space. They create low-grade cognitive tension. Your brain does not like open loops. So what happens? You keep revisiting it. You think you're being thoughtful, but really you're just keeping the loop open. And the longer it stays open, the scarier it feels to close it. Decisive people do something very simple. They contain the decision. They don't let it sprawl. They don't let it turn into a 6-week internal debate. They give it a boundary, not because they're impulsive, but because they understand that thinking beyond a certain point just doesn't increase clarity. It increases anxiety. So here's what this looks like practically. For small decisions, 5 minutes. For medium decisions, 24 hours. For big decisions, maybe 72 hours. That's it. Not until I feel calm. Not until I feel 100% sure. Not until I've consumed every opinion on the internet. A container. Because when you put a container around a decision, something really interesting happens. Your brain stops wandering and starts choosing. And I'll tell you something that I have noticed in my own life. The longer I drag a decision out, the more dramatic it becomes in my head. When I decided to do a TED Talk, that could have turned into months of should I, shouldn't I, is it worth it? Instead, I gave it a window. I looked at the numbers. I looked at my schedule. I looked at the kind of person that I want to be 3 years from now. And then I chose. Was I calm? Not entirely. Was I aligned? Yes. And that's enough. There's also fascinating research on decision fatigue. Judges, for example, are significantly less likely to grant parole later in the day. Same facts, different time. Why? Cognitive depletion. The more decisions that you delay, the more drained you become. And drained people default to avoidance. Indecision feels like neutrality, but it's actually a slow leak of energy. You do not need infinite analysis. You need a boundary. And just to be clear, this is not about rushing life-altering decisions. It's about recognizing that overthinking past a certain point is not intelligence. It's self-doubt in disguise. And decisive people don't eliminate doubt. They just limit its airtime. Now, even when you decide from let go of the perfect option identity, and even when you shorten the window, there is still something that traps people. It's the fantasy that there's a perfect option. So let's talk about that. This is the fourth shift. You have to drop the fantasy that there is a perfect decision hiding somewhere. And if you just think long enough, you'll find it, because that fantasy is what keeps you stuck. A lot of overthinking is actually this quiet belief. There is one right answer, and if I choose wrong, I'll regret it. That sounds responsible. It sounds thoughtful, but it's not realistic. Most decisions, especially the ones that you are agonizing over, they're not right versus wrong. They're trade-offs. That's it. Different trade-offs. And when you're unwilling to accept trade-offs, you end up chasing perfection, which doesn't exist. Let's go back to something simple. Let's say that you are deciding between two job offers. One pays more, one has more flexibility. There isn't a perfect choice. There is a choice that prioritizes money or a choice that prioritizes freedom. But your brain wants both, so it stalls. Because if you wait long enough, maybe a third magical, flawless option will appear. It won't. There's some fascinating research on regret. Psychological research has consistently shown that over time, people tend to regret inaction more than action. Not immediately. Immediately, action feels scarier. But years later, people regret the risks that they didn't take far more than the imperfect ones that they did. That's really important, because when you delay a decision trying to avoid regret, you may actually be manufacturing a different kind of regret. The slow, lingering kind. There's also something called maximizer versus satisficer theory. Maximizers try to find the absolute best option. They keep comparing and researching and checking alternatives. Satisficers choose an option that meets their criteria and then move forward. And guess who's happier? Not the maximizers. They actually report more stress and more regret and less satisfaction with their decisions, even when they made a perfectly good choice, because they keep wondering if something better was out there. So if that's you, just know this is not a moral flaw. It's just a pattern, and patterns can be adjusted. So here's the practical tool, the 70% rule. You don't need 100% certainty. You don't need 100% information. If you have roughly 70% of what you need to make a thoughtful decision, choose, because the last 30%, that's usually noise or fear or both. And here's the part that nobody likes hearing. Even the right decision will contain discomfort. Even the aligned decision will close doors. Even the exciting decision will come with trade-offs. That doesn't mean it was wrong. It means you chose. I've had moments in my life where I thought, if I just think a little longer, I'll feel better about this. I never did. What made me feel better was committing. Once I committed, energy shifted. Clarity increased after the decision, not before. That's something that people rarely talk about. Clarity often follows commitment, not the other way around. So the shift here is this. Stop hunting for the perfect option. Start choosing the direction that you're willing to back. There's a big difference. When you choose something that you're willing to back, you stop scanning the horizon for something better. You put your energy into making the choice work. And that's where decisiveness actually compounds. Decisiveness feels uncomfortable. Okay, let's move on to the next thing that still makes people hesitate, and it's this. Decisiveness doesn't feel the way you think it will. Here's something that most people misunderstand. They think decisive people feel calm. They imagine the decisiveness feels like clarity and confidence and maybe even relief. It doesn't. Most of the time, decisiveness feels like tension. It feels like your stomach tightening slightly. It feels like closing a door. It feels like risk. And that's the part that trips people up. Because when you decide, especially on something that's meaningful, your nervous system interprets it as uncertainty. And uncertainty registers as threat. Not dramatic threat, just enough to make you hesitate. So what do most people do? They interpret that discomfort as a signal. They think, if I were making the right choice, I would feel better. But that is not how growth works. Growth feels destabilizing. Commitment feels exposed. And finality feels uncomfortable. That doesn't mean you chose wrong. It means you chose. So shift number 5 is to accept that decisiveness feels uncomfortable. There's a concept in psychology called emotional avoidance. We avoid things that create discomfort, even small discomfort. And indecision is one of the cleanest avoidance strategies that there is. Because if you don't decide, you don't have to feel the vulnerability of commitment. You can stay in the hypothetical, and hypotheticals are safe. They're also exhausting. So let's make this real. Imagine that you finally send the email. You raise your rates, You book the flight, you sign up for the thing. There's usually a beat afterward, a moment where you think, oh, not panic, just intensity. And if you're not expecting that sensation, you might think, I shouldn't have done that. But decisive people expect that feeling. They don't interpret it as danger. They interpret it as expansion. It's a very different internal story. I've noticed this in my own life more times than I can count. When I committed to building this channel seriously, when I decided to write a book, when I made certain professional pivots, there was never a wave of pure serenity. There was a tightening, but it wasn't wrongness. It was responsibility. And responsibility feels heavier than possibility. That doesn't make it bad. It just makes it real. Stop expecting decisiveness to feel soothing. Start expecting it to feel slightly uncomfortable. When you normalize that sensation, it stops controlling you. Because now when your body reacts, you think, there it is, instead of, oh no, abort mission. If every meaningful decision in your life felt completely cozy, you would probably still be in your childhood bedroom. Comfort is not the metric. Alignment is. And here's something subtle but important. The more that you avoid that discomfort, the more fragile your self-trust becomes because your nervous system learns. We don't commit, we retreat. But every time that you stay with the discomfort and follow through, your nervous system learns, we can handle this. That's how decisiveness compounds. Not because you eliminated fear, but because you reduced your reactivity to it. Now, there's one more piece. Because even when you understand identity, even when you contain your decisions, even when you accept trade-offs, even when you tolerate discomfort, there is something foundational that makes all of this easier. It has to do with how often you keep your word to yourself. So, let's talk about that. Here's the final shift, and honestly, this might be the most. Make fewer promises. Keep them fully. Important one. Decisiveness gets easier when you stop violating your own identity. So, let me explain what I mean. Every time that you say you're going to do something and then you don't, you weaken self-trust. And when self-trust weakens, decisions get harder because now every choice feels risky. You're not just choosing between some options. You're choosing whether you can rely on yourself afterward. That's exhausting. Think about how many micro-promises people make in a week. I'll start Monday. I'll wake up early. I'll go to the gym. I'll send that email. I'll practice. And then maybe or maybe not. Indecision grows in that space because part of you knows, if I choose this, will I actually follow through? And if the answer has historically been probably not, your brain hesitates, not because you're incapable, but because you have trained it not to expect consistency. So here's the shift. Make fewer promises, but keep them fully. Even small ones, especially small ones. If you say that you're going to update your resume, update it. If you say that you are going to go to the gym, go. If you say you're going to have the hard conversation, have it. When you become someone who follows through in small ways, your identity stabilizes. And when your identity stabilizes, decisions stop feeling like gambles. They start feeling like extensions of who you are. I've seen this in my own life. When I started taking golf seriously, I didn't decide I'm going to be amazing. I decided I'm going to show up consistently. Not dramatically, just consistently. And once that became true, once I had proof, deciding to invest more time or money didn't feel reckless. It felt coherent because I had evidence. Self-trust isn't a mindset trick. It's accumulated proof. So here's the quiet truth. Indecision often isn't about the choice. It's about this underlying question. Can I trust myself to handle the outcome? When the answer is yes, even a calm, quiet yes, decisions simplify. When the answer is uncertain, everything feels heavier. You don't need a new personality. You probably just need to stop ghosting yourself. If you want to become more decisive, don't start with bigger risks. Start with tighter integrity. Choose small things. Follow through. Stack proof. Let your nervous system learn. We choose, we act, we handle it. And then watch how much faster the bigger decisions move. So let me get more from you with this. Decisiveness isn't something that you're born with. It's something that you build. It's a muscle that you strengthen over time. And most people don't struggle with decisions because they're incapable. They struggle because they have trained themselves to hesitate. They've trained themselves to wait for certainty. They've trained themselves to avoid discomfort. They've trained themselves not to fully trust their own follow-through. And none of that is permanent. It's just learned, which means it can be unlearned. That's it. It's not magic. It's not personality. It's practice. And if you're watching this and you're realizing, oh, I do this, I delay, I overthink, I pull back, I created something specifically for that pattern. It's called the Self-Sabotage Recovery Guide. It is completely free, and it just walks you through how to recognize the subtle ways that you undermine your own progress and how to interrupt them before they spiral. Because indecision is one of the most common forms of self-sabotage, and once you see it, you can start changing it. So you can download that below. And if this video resonated with you, the next one that you should watch is called How to Stop Talking Yourself Out of Things You Want. That video goes deeper into the emotional pattern behind hesitation and self-sabotage. And it connects directly to everything that we have just talked about today. So I will link it on the next screen, and then I will see you there. Okay, wait. Hold everything. Wait, shoulder tension. Wait, I am recording, right? Yeah, okay, moment of panic. All right.